The U.S. Supreme Court is hearing arguments today in the case of Murthy versus Missouri. This involves the effort to keep misinformation from being spread online. Chris Bryant is in our newsroom monitoring this for us and joins us now with details. Chris, what do we know so far?
Yeah, good afternoon, Steve. The case comes from then Missouri Attorney General and current United States Senator Eric Schmitt when he filed a lawsuit along with the Attorney General from the state of Louisiana called Missouri versus Biden. At the time, the lawsuit claimed that government officials within the Biden administration violated the First Amendment by encouraging social media companies to censor content on platforms like X, formerly Twitter, and Facebook. Some of the content the lawsuit claims was censored was the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, the effectiveness of masks and vaccine, as well as voting by mail security and the 2020 presidential election. The questions asked by attorneys in the case asked if the content moderation violated the First Amendment rights and if the preliminary injunction by the lower courts was proper. Justice Alito was presented the case and recommended that the United States Supreme Court hear it. Dr. Kevin Pius with Missouri State University says the base of the case is if the private social media companies did censoring themselves or not.
There has to be some real possibility now of those constitutional rights being violated. I mean, the court could say, yeah, they were violated in the past, but there's no ongoing. So, and then another way to avoid reaching the merits would be to say that what the trial court, district court in federal district court in Louisiana did was too broad.
Now, Missouri Attorney General, current Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey is expected to make comments later today in Washington, D.C. We'll have some of those for you today at 4 o'clock. For now in the newsroom, Chris Bryant, KY3 News.